Burgess Meredith first came on the set as Penguin.
The neon lights of 1960s Hollywood had a way of blinding everyone to the shadows lurking just behind the glitter. We remember the colors, the vibrant purples, the saturated yellows, and the biff, bam, pow that danced across our television screens. But behind the mask of the world's most famous detective stood a man of profound intellect, a man of the Pacific Northwest who found himself imprisoned by the very cape that made him a god. Before we pull back the velvet curtain on the life of William West Anderson, the man the world would come to know as Adam West, I want to ask you, where are you joining us from today? Whether you're watching from a quiet study in New England or a sun-drenched porch in Florida, I'm honored to have you here. This channel is dedicated to the legends of the Golden and Silver Ages, the stories that the modern world is too fast to remember. If you value this kind of deep dive into cinematic history, please consider subscribing to our community. We are growing, and your support is the only reason these stories stay alive. Now, let us step into the fog of 1966. To understand Adam West, you must first forget the pow and the zap. You must look at the eyes behind the cowl. In the mid-60s, television was a landscape of westerns and gritty procedurals. When ABC brought Batman to life, they didn't want a clown. They wanted a leading man who could play the most absurd lines with the gravitas of a Shakespearean tragedy. That was the secret of his performance. The deadpan delivery that flew right over the heads of children but landed perfectly with the sophisticated adults of the era. However, this brilliance came with a staggering cost. West wasn't just playing a character, he was entering into a Faustian bargain with the industry. But long before the bat signal ever lit up the sky, there was a young man from Walla Walla, Washington, who dreamed of something far more grounded. Born in 1928, Adam grew up in a world of literature and rugged landscapes. His father was a wheat farmer, a man of the earth, while his mother was an opera singer and a pianist whose own Hollywood dreams had been cut short. Can you imagine the internal conflict? The pull between the stoic silence of the farm and the dramatic flair of the stage. This duality would define his entire career. He was a man of high culture, an avid reader with a degree in literature and psychology. Yet he became a caricature of a comic book hero. After a stint in the military and a move to Hawaii where he became a local television star, Hollywood finally noticed that jawline and that voice. He was signed by Warner Bros., and for a moment, he was the heir apparent to the great leading men of the 1950s. He moved with a quiet elegance, a certain noir mystery that suggested he could play a detective in a smoke-filled room just as easily as a romantic lead. In fact, his screen presence was so commanding that when Sean Connery stepped away from the role of James Bond after You Only Live Twice, the producers turned their eyes toward Adam West. Think about that for a moment. The trajectory of cinematic history almost shifted on its axis. West was offered the role of 007 in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. It was the ultimate prize for any actor, the tuxedo, the Walther PPK, the global prestige. But Adam, in a move that displayed both his integrity and perhaps a touch of tragic foresight, turned it down. He believed that James Bond should be played by a British actor. He respected the source material too much to Americanize the icon. He chose the path of the Bright Knight instead, unaware that he was walking into a golden cage from which he would spend the next 30 years trying to escape. When the Batman craze hit in 1966, it wasn't just a success, it was a cultural explosion. Batmania took over the world. But while the public was obsessed with the gadgets and the campy humor, Adam West was navigating a professional minefield. He was working 18-hour days, suffocating under a heavy wool costume, and dealing with a level of fame that made it impossible to walk down the street. He was the most famous man on the planet, yet he was becoming invisible. The industry stopped seeing the actor who had studied the classics. They only saw the mask, The first secret the studio executives never wanted you to know was how much Adam actually contributed to the writing. He knew that if he played the role straight, the show would fail. He was the one who insisted on the clueless authority persona, the idea that Batman was so dedicated to the law that he was almost out of touch with reality. It was a brilliant satirical take on the 1960s establishment, but the more he leaned into the satire, the more the world forgot he was acting. They thought he was that man. As the series reached its peak, the cracks began to show. The budget started to dry up by the third season, the sets became cheaper, and the scripts more repetitive. When the show was finally canceled in 1968, Adam West stepped out of the Batcave and into a vacuum. He expected his phone to ring with offers for dramas, thrillers, and perhaps a return to the noir roots he loved. Instead, there was silence. He had become too recognizable. He was typecast in a way that few actors in history ever have been. He went from being a millionaire icon to a man who couldn't get an audition for a soap opera. This is where the story takes a darker turn, into the years that the fans rarely talk about. Imagine the psychological toll of being a hero to millions of children while being unable to provide for your own. He found himself in a position where he had to sell his dignity just to keep the lights on. He was forced to make personal appearances in full costume at car shows, grocery store openings, and even circuses. There is a heartbreaking account of him being shot out of a cannon at a fair in Indiana, the cape fluttering behind him as he flew through the air for a few dollars. This wasn't the life of a Hollywood star. It was the life of a man haunted by a ghost he couldn't exorcise. But even in these wilderness years, Adam West never lost his wit. He would often check into hotels under the name Bruce Wayne just to see if the staff would notice. He maintained a sense of humor that shielded a very real and very deep sense of rejection. He watched as other actors of his generation, men he had worked alongside, went on to win Oscars and star in gritty crime dramas. Meanwhile, he was trapped in a cycle of nostalgia, a relic of a decade that the 1970s wanted to forget. Yet, there was a secret strength in his refusal to give up. He didn't turn to the vices that claimed so many of his peers. He stayed loyal to his family and his craft, even when the craft didn't stay loyal to him. What most people don't realize is that during this time, West was actually offered several roles in serious films, but they were often conditional on him poking fun at his Batman persona. He refused. He wanted to be an actor again, not a punchline. This stubbornness cost him dearly in the short term, but it preserved the very thing that would eventually lead to his massive comeback decades later. He was protecting the legacy of the character even when that character was the very thing holding him back. But the most fascinating part of this era isn't the struggle. It's the mysterious way he began to influence the very Dark Knight persona that would eventually replace him. Before Michael Keaton or Christian Bale ever growled a line of dialogue, Adam West was exploring the duality of a man who lives two lives, and the truth about his real-life transition from the bright knight to a forgotten man is more compelling than any comic book plot. Because just when the world thought Adam West was finished, a new generation of filmmakers, men who had grown up watching him, began to reach out from the shadows. But that return to the spotlight wasn't as easy as putting the mask back on. It required a complete reinvention of who Adam West was, and the secret to that reinvention lay in a small town in Idaho and a very unexpected phone call from a young animator. But before we get to the redemption, we have to talk about the night Adam West almost lost everything. The late 1970s and early 80s were a cold, unforgiving winter for the man who once held the keys to the city. Imagine, if you will, a man of profound dignity, a classically trained actor who once shared the screen with giants, now standing in the middle of a muddy field in the American Midwest. He is wearing a cheap synthetic version of the costume that once cost thousands of dollars. The wind is biting, and the crowd isn't filled with adoring fans at a premiere, but with curious onlookers at a county fair, waiting for him to do something heroic for a few $100s. This was the Ghost of Batman era. It was a period of profound psychological testing. But what nobody tells you is that Adam West never let the mask slip in public. He maintained a stoic, almost noir-like resilience, even when his bank account was nearing zero. The industry has a cruel way of discarding its icons once the trend shifts. By 1975, the camp era was dead. Cinema had turned gritty, dark, and cynical. New Hollywood, the era of The Godfather and Taxi Driver, had no room for a man associated with bright colors and moral certainties. Adam found himself in a professional purgatory. He was too Batman for serious roles, and too serious for the new wave of comedy. It is a secret heartache that he rarely discussed in interviews, but those close to him knew the truth. The phone simply stopped ringing. The silence in his home in those years was louder than any kapow from the television screen. However, even in this era of struggle, there were moments of hidden brilliance that the mainstream public missed. Did you know that Adam West was one of the first actors to truly embrace the independent circuit long before it was fashionable? He took roles in low-budget European films and obscure detective pilots, hoping to find a character that would allow him to shed the blue and gray spandex. He was searching for a noir redemption. He wanted to play the weary private eye, the man with a past, a role that mirrored his own reality. But the shadow of the bat was too long. Casting directors would look at his rugged, handsome face and only see the cowl. It was a psychological haunting that would have broken a lesser man. But there was a secret weapon Adam possessed: his voice. That unmistakable resonant baritone that commanded attention. While his face was forbidden on the silver screen due to his overwhelming association with Bruce Wayne, his voice began to find a new life. He started working in the shadows of the industry, doing voiceovers, narrations, and radio spots. It was a humble pivot, but it was the first step toward a reinvention that no one saw coming. He realized that if the world wouldn't let him be Adam West the actor, he would become Adam West the icon. There is a story, whispered in the corridors of old Hollywood, about a night in the late 80s when the first dark Batman film was being cast. Adam, ever the gentleman, reached out to the production. He didn't want to play the lead. He knew that time had passed, but he wanted to play the father, Thomas Wayne. He wanted to pass the torch, to give his blessing to the new generation. The rejection he received was cold and clinical. The producers wanted nothing to do with the 1966 version. They wanted to bury it. They thought Adam West was a joke. Can you imagine the sting? To be the foundation upon which a billion-dollar empire was built, only to be told you weren't dark enough to stand in its shadow. But this is where the climax of his personal journey begins. Instead of retreating into bitterness, Adam did something revolutionary. He began to lean into the absurdity. He stopped fighting the ghost and started dancing with it. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was born out of a realization that he had something no other actor had: a direct, emotional connection to the childhoods of an entire generation. He started appearing at conventions, not as a washed-up star, but as a sage. He treated every fan with the same gravitas he gave to his scripts. He was building a grassroots legacy that the Hollywood studios couldn't control. Then came the turning point, the moment that changed everything. It started with a phone call from a young, irreverent animator named Seth MacFarlane. He didn't want Adam West to play a superhero. He wanted Adam West to play Adam West, a surreal, heightened, and utterly hilarious version of himself as the mayor of a town called Quahog. It was a risky move. It required Adam to poke fun at his own dignity, his own career, and his own legend. A man of 70 years old was being asked to reinvent himself for a generation that hadn't even been born when his show was canceled. Many of his contemporaries would have said no. They would have stayed trapped in their memories of the good old days. But Adam was different. He had the intellect to understand the meta nature of the role. He walked into that recording booth and delivered a performance that was so bizarre, so deadpan, and so brilliant that he became a superstar all over again. He wasn't just a former Batman anymore. He was a comedic genius. He had survived the wilderness and emerged as a king of a new kind of media. But there is a detail about this era that almost no one talks about. Despite his newfound fame on Family Guy, Adam remained a man of quiet, sophisticated tastes. He lived far from the chaos of Los Angeles, choosing the mountains of Idaho as his sanctuary. He was a man who preferred the company of his family and the silence of the wilderness to the red carpets of Hollywood. He had found a balance that most stars never achieve. He had the fame, he had the respect, but he also had his soul. However, there was one final secret that Adam carried with him until the very end. It was a dream he never quite gave up on. A dream of one last Noir performance. He spent his final years writing, painting, and reflecting on the nature of heroism. He knew his time was winding down, but he worked with the energy of a man half his age. He was determined to leave the world with a smile rather than a sigh. And the way he faced his final battle with leukemia was perhaps his most heroic act of all. It was a private struggle, kept away from the tabloids, handled with the same quiet dignity that he brought to everything he did. But the most shocking revelation isn't how he died. It's what he left behind in his private archives. A legacy that proves he was far more than just a man in a costume. He was a philosopher of the popular arts. And as we move toward the final chapter of this journey, we have to ask, what is the real cost of being an icon? And why, even after all the struggles, did he say he wouldn't change a single thing? The final truth about Adam West is more moving than any script he ever performed. And it starts with a light that was turned on in Los Angeles one final time on a night when the city stood still. As the 21st century dawned, something miraculous happened. The world stopped laughing at Adam West and started laughing with him. But more importantly, they started to respect him. The noir irony of his life is that by embracing the absurdity of his fame, he finally gained the serious recognition he had craved for decades. He was no longer a has-been in a dusty costume. He was a pioneer of self-referential humor, a man who had mastered the art of the meta-performance before the term even existed. But behind that late career success, there was a quiet, profound wisdom. He once said in a private moment that fame is a fickle mistress, but a sense of humor is a loyal wife. He had survived the crushing weight of being a cultural icon by learning to carry that weight with a smile. But what of the darkness we often associate with Batman? In his later years, Adam watched as the character he pioneered became increasingly grim, violent, and joyless in the hands of modern directors. He didn't criticize them. He was too much of a gentleman for that. But he often lamented that the light had been taken out of the myth. He believed that a hero should inspire hope, not just fear. It was a philosophy he lived by until his very last breath. He remained accessible to his fans, often staying hours after a convention ended to ensure every person who had traveled to see him felt valued. He knew what it was like to be forgotten, and he made sure his fans never felt that way. The secret to his longevity wasn't just his voice or his comic timing, it was his resilience. In the final decade of his life, even as he battled the leukemia that would eventually take him, he never complained. He kept working, he kept narrating, he kept being Adam West. He saw his career as a marathon, not a sprint. And when he reached the finish line on June 9, 2017, he did so with his family by his side and his dignity intact. He died at the age of 88, a man who had lived a dozen lives in one. On the night he passed, the city of Los Angeles did something it rarely does for anyone. They didn't just put out a press release or hold a moment of silence. They projected the bat signal onto the side of City Hall. Thousands of people gathered in the streets, looking up at the sky. They weren't just mourning an actor, they were mourning a part of their own childhood, a symbol of a simpler time. But they were also celebrating a man who had taught us all how to lose everything and still come out on top. It was the ultimate noir ending, a light in the darkness, a signal to the world that even when the man is gone, the hero remains. As we look back at the 11 secret facts and the long shadow of the caped Crusader, we realize that the most important fact of all wasn't something hidden in a vault. It was the man himself, William West Anderson, the boy from the wheat fields who became a god of the silver screen, fell into the abyss of obscurity and climbed his way back out through sheer force of will and a brilliant, dry wit. He proved that you don't need superpowers to be a hero. You just need the courage to be yourself, even when the world wants you to be someone else. If you've stayed with me this far, it's because you, like me, believe that these stories matter, that the men and women who shaped our culture deserve to be remembered for more than just their highlight reels. They were humans, with fears and struggles and secrets. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel. It's a small gesture, but it helps us keep these memories from fading into the fog of history. Don't let the cycle of being a passive observer keep you from appreciating the depth of the world around you. If we ignore the lessons of those who came before us, we are doomed to repeat their mistakes without ever achieving their grace. Adam West is gone, but the bat signal is still there if you know where to look. It's in the way we handle rejection, the way we treat our fans, and the way we refuse to let the world define us. Thank you for walking through the shadows with me today. Remember, the sun always rises, even in Gotham. Until next time.